The fierce battles on the Eastern Front don't stop at the front lines. As the German army retreats in the face of the advancing Red Army, it is being hit in the rear by Soviet partisans. Across vast swaths of land, these partisans are fighting a vicious rail war. They blow up railways, derail trains, and of course kill fascists. Every successful attack slows down the Axis war machine a little bit more, but it's never too long before that machine strikes back in brutal fashion. This is a special episode of War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. The Soviet partisans operate in the great vacuums of no man's land behind the German front lines. With the Wehrmacht stretched thin, it's impossible to police these areas effectively. This is how a German officer of the 16th Army, part of Army Group North, will describe the situation after the war. In this large area of about 3,000 square kilometers, there was not a single German soldier, still less a German administration. The area was left to itself because manpower for its garrisoning was lacking. Its actual masters were the partisans. The partisans fight the railway war from these islands in the German rear. Of course, they also target the roads, supply dumps, field hospitals, and other targets. But because the Soviet Union road network is so limited, railways take center stage. Their tracks carry the German war machine. And the partisans have had some significant successes that have had real impact on German operations. By interrupting rail connections to the Don region, the partisans contributed to delaying Operation Wintersturm, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's attempted relief of the German garrison in Stalingrad in December 1942. But the overall effect that year is limited. After the war, the Soviets will proudly proclaim that between June and November, the Belarusian partisans destroyed or damaged 800 trains and blew up 500 bridges. They also claim that partisans in Bryansk and Smolensk took out another 526 trains. These figures sound impressive, but even if we set aside the likelihood that they are inflated, this only accounts for 10% of German trains being sabotaged, and as we shall see, the figure of 800 trains derailed in 6 months pales in comparison to what the partisans get up to in 1943. Of course, destroying a railway is easier said than done. The Germans guard them viciously. They have built checkpoints bristling with men and machine guns. They have cleared the forest on either side of the tracks and recruited locals as lookouts. The trains themselves are mobile fortresses, each carrying a 20mm flak gun and a small unit of riflemen. Dealing with these defenses is only half the battle. Inflicting lasting damage on a railway is difficult. In the wake of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans repaired most of the massive sabotage inflicted by the retreating Red Army in a matter of months. So the partisans select their targets carefully. A 1942 training manual offers advice on where to deploy explosive. The demolition of railway tracks is most fruitful at those points where maintenance work is particularly difficult. For example, at bends and cuttings or high embankments, in localities with deep slopes and declivities, at road crossings. In the absence of explosives, the partisans resort to brutal force. First, they remove the rails from the base plates and sleepers. Then, as the train approaches, they drag the rails away using strong ropes or telegraph wires. It's a risky tactic, but it gives the train driver very little time to react. The other option is to target the locomotives themselves using anti-rail mines. This has actually kicked off a small arms race of mines and mine countermeasures. The Germans start by attaching an empty wagon to run ahead of the train. This detonates the mine, destroying the empty wagon but saving the valuable locomotive. In response, the partisans introduce pressure-sensitive mines. These allow an empty wagon to pass over them and only detonate underneath the heavy locomotive. So the Germans start filling the empty wagons with rocks or gravel. The partisans respond by laying a chain of mines along the track, ensuring that at least some of them will detonate under the locomotive rather than the empty wagon. Once the train has been blown up or derailed, partisan fighters move in to finish the job. They advance on the halted train, engaging the defenders with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. Once the enemy is defeated, they load themselves up with anything useful and make their escape. Time is of the essence. A partisan should always assume that the enemy is hunting them down. And that assumption is usually correct, with the Axis deploying their advantage in men and machinery. Their goal is to encircle the partisans and wipe them out en masse. Here, a German major explains how to do this. If a larger area where the bandits are either in control or in which they have infiltrated can be encircled by surprise movements and can be systematically combed, then success will not be lacking. Sector by sector and day by day, the ring is narrowed, either by a concentrated advance or by pressing the enemy against the prearranged fortified line, which can be strengthened by utilizing natural obstacles, such as a river. That's all well and good in theory, but a better way to describe the reality of the partisan war might be some words attributed to another German officer, a field marshal, in summer 1942. 16th Army learns that no plans survive the first contact with the enemy. They receive intelligence on the location of a partisan headquarters and supply depot. But they can't launch an encirclement because the target sits in the center of 3 villages, which are on a narrow strip of land surrounded on 3 sides by swamp. Instead, a regiment of troops and vehicles advance in column towards the objective. Their aim is to force the partisans into a fight and overwhelm them with superior firepower. But as the Germans advance, something feels off. This place is a partisan hotspot, but the only people they encounter are old men and women, and they're hardly talkative. The German officer writes, questioned about partisans, they replied that they had seen none. The Germans continue advancing. As they close in on their objective, there's still no sign of any partisan or a supply depot or headquarters. The officer continues his story. Toward evening, the 2 columns approached the main supply depot without having been attacked and without having sighted a single armed partisan. The 3 villages were not defended. Not a single round of ammunition nor a bag of flour was to be found. They spend another 2 weeks crisscrossing the area. The soldiers wade through swamps, chase down cattle herders, and search through villages. They try to bait the partisans into fighting by ordering the Luftwaffe to shoot all livestock. But all their efforts are in vain. The partisans have been forewarned thanks to their reconnaissance patrols or their spies. They have already slipped away by night, trekking to safer areas or Soviet-held territory. They've brought the locals over to their side, either through threats, enticement, or a mix of both. It's a story familiar to anyone with experience fighting guerrillas, and it's a pattern that's repeated again and again. The Axis conducts several major anti-partisan operations in the spring and summer of 1943. They kill and capture thousands of fighters. They destroy hundreds, if not thousands, of camps and bunkers, and take tons of weapons and ammunition. But if we look at one of these operations more closely, we see the problem. In Operation Zigeunerbaron, or Gypsy Baron, in May 1943, 2 German panzer divisions, a Hungarian infantry division, and security police and Osttruppen face 6,000 partisans in a pocket south of Bryansk. The Axis forces sweep the area from east to west, and they manage to pin the partisans against the Desna River. By June 6th, the Axis have killed 1,600 partisans and taken another 1,600 prisoner. But are they really all partisans? Well, probably not. German forces follow the brutal doctrine of Bandenbekämpfung, or bandit fighting. Murder of the innocent is the hallmark of this doctrine, which is rooted in the Nazi hatred of Jews, Slavs, and communists. Across the occupied Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Poland, women and children are shot, hanged, and burned to their death in their villages by the Germans and their allies. I cover these sorts of operations every week, more or less, in War Against Humanity. But unrestrained murder is not just a symptom of Nazi ideology. The Germans shoot defenseless civilians in part because their tactical failures allow the real partisans to escape, regroup, and fight another day. After Operation Zigeunerbaron is over, About 3,000 partisans returned to the area by the end of July, while others have moved on to new units. In other words, the Germans have managed to tell themselves that they have killed or captured 3,200 partisans, but in effect, they've managed to kill and capture a bunch of people who mostly pose no threat. Not only do these atrocities miss the target, it keeps the German units busy while the actual partisans are regrouping. And an ever-increasing flow of fresh manpower join these ghost units that keep the Wehrmacht and SS fumbling through the fog of war. The Red Army advancing westwards in the summer of 1943, the partisans work harder than ever to conscript as many men and women living in the German rear as they can. Now that people can see which way the wind is blowing, not only is there an increase in volunteers, but those who have collaborated with the Germans begin defecting in greater numbers. Gauging the size of a movement this secretive and nebulous is tricky, but partisan strength is estimated at anything from 150,000 to 250,000 by the end of 1943. Either way, this is a significant increase from 1942. And it's not just the numbers. Partisan formations are better organized and led by veterans with 2 years combat experience. The central headquarters of the partisan movement in Moscow also sends ever greater quantities of weaponry. Flown into landing strips, the partisans have cut into their territory. Between May 1943 and January 1944, Moscow sends 33,000 rifles and carbines, 5,700 pistols and revolvers, 17,000 submachine guns, 2,600 machine guns, 590 anti-tank rifles, 740 mortars, and over 200,000 grenades. Weapons that are put to direct use to support the regular Red Army's offensives. In the summer of 1943, partisan headquarters orders the partisans to disrupt German preparations for their offensive at Kursk and to support the Soviet counteroffensive that will come in response. They distribute a training manual with the rousing title, "Partisans, Destroy the Enemy's Railways." Between June 15th and July 11th, 1943, headquarters sends 150 tons of explosives, along with hundreds of thousands of fuses and detonators. The main focus of the partisan effort is behind the lines of Army Group Center. A closer look at the figures for July tells us why. In July, the partisans carry out 1,114 attacks, which destroy or damage 358 locomotives and 1,235 wagons. But the Germans work hard to minimize any disruption. They establish mobile construction units to fix breaches in the tracks. They protect locomotives by running them in the center of the train rather than the front. The security forces also remove mines and explosives before they can detonate. This means that in July, over 80% of Army Group Center's trains pass through successfully. That's over 2,900 trains. But the partisans are just getting started. As the Soviet Central, Voronezh Steppe, Southwestern, and Southern fronts accelerate their offensives, the partisans work to prevent German reserves from reaching the front. On August 3rd, the partisans launch an operation along a 1,000-kilometer front, which penetrates up to 1,000 kilometers behind the lines of all three German army groups. It's a massive acceleration of operations. Exact figures are hard to come by, but Army Group Center reports that the number of demolitions of rail lines increases by a multiple of 30. An OKW diary entry from August 6th records that railway communications in the rear of Army Group Center are paralyzed. The 50,000 staff of German Transport Command in the sector cannot keep up with the rate of repairs. This continues into the autumn, with the partisans coordinating closely with the regular army. When the Red Army opens up a 15-mile wide gap between German Army Group Center and North at Neidell in October, the partisans prevent Field Marshal Georg von Küchler from launching a counterattack by interrupting the rail transports of reserves. And now, in January 1944, the partisans behind Army Group North are gearing up to support the Red Army in breaking the siege of Leningrad. The stories of the partisans are certainly thrilling, and they have undoubtedly displayed skill and daring in this rail war. They've come a long way from the scattered bands of resistance fighters who operated behind the German lines in 1941. But it's important not to romanticize them. They are an increasingly effective military force, but post-war Soviet media and propaganda will glorify them, portraying them as virtual superheroes. But these aren't bands of superheroes single-handedly winning the war. Yes, they have hindered the Wehrmacht and contributed to Soviet victories, but German forces continue flowing to the front. And like the regime they're fighting for, the partisans aren't afraid to deploy intimidation, theft, violence, and even murder against their own people. Their ruthless methods and the genocidal Axis countermeasures both contribute to the brutalization of warfare on the Eastern Front. If you'd like to learn more about partisans in another occupied territory, click here for our special on the Yugoslav partisans and the short-lived Republic of Sietse. Remember that we here at Time Ghost have our own partisan force that is an integral part of our non-violent, benevolent war on ignorance and prejudice. It is that force, the Time Ghost Army, that makes everything we do possible. Join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Never forget.